welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli, and we're a little late today. So thank you, everybody who has joined me for our Thursday night live stream. And it's been kind of a busy day. A lot of things happened today. And we obviously had all the events in Davos, and I want to talk a little bit about that. But of course, there was one event that wasn't noticed very much, and that is that another tanker has been seized in the Mediterranean. So this is a tanker supposedly carrying carrying um, Russian oil, and it was seized by the French Navy. And this was announced by Emmanuel Macron. He sent out a tweet. Let's take a look at this tweet that he sent out. And he seemed obviously very pleased with himself. And here he is. We will not tolerate any violation, he says. This morning, the French Navy boarded an oil tanker coming from Russia, subject to international sanctions and suspected of flying a false flag. All right. So right away, this is all nonsense. There's no violation here. They board an oil tanker coming from Russia. It's subject to international sanctions. The sanctions are not international. They may be EU sanctions, but they're not international sanctions. And then he says something different, which is suspected of flying a false flag. Now, notice he doesn't actually say it was flying a false flag. It was suspected of flying a false flag. But as I said last week, because we discussed this when the British seized the tanker in the Atlantic, the British and the Americans, as I said, and it's very important that according to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, there's no sanction on flying a false flag. I mean, if you fly a false flag, then you could be boarded. They could determine what flag you're flying under, and then they can report this to the International Maritime Organization, or they can report it to the state whose flag you are allegedly falsely flying. But that's about it. There's nothing at all in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea that permits any state to seize the ship in the high seas. The only basis on doing so, and we went over this last week, the only basis on doing so is if you're suspected of engaging in piracy, or you're suspected of engaging in the slave trade. That's about it. So the notion that you're flying a false flag, and therefore that enables another state to seize your ship is just nonsense. They're just completely made up by the Europeans. These are the people who constantly talking about international law, and so now he's done it. So Macron goes on. The operation was conducted on the high seas in the Mediterranean high seas. So it's in the international waters. So the tanker was in international waters with the support of several of our allies. It was carried out in strict compliance with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is false. Absolutely, totally, ridiculously false. It was not in compliance with the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea because, as I said, it does not permit the seizure of ships. And false flag. That's just simply you haven't done the proper paperwork. That doesn't entitle anyone to just go around grabbing ships in the seas. A judicial investigation has been opened. The vessel has been diverted. We are determined to uphold international law by violating it and to ensure the effective enforcement of sanctions which have no legal basis. The activities of the Shadow Fleet contribute to the financing of the war of aggression against Ukraine. So notice how what he's done here is supposedly he claims some legal basis for seizure of the ship because it allegedly was flying a false flag. And then he says, well, the real reason is that it's financing the war of aggression against Ukraine. So therefore, he's providing a completely different justification. Of course, the whole point of seizing the ship is precisely to hit Russia. Now, when we just talked about this last week, it was always obvious that this is something that now the Europeans are going to be doing on a regular basis. I said they're going to do it on a regular basis. I mean, the British already said, yeah, we're going to do it on a regular basis. This was said by John Healey, the UK defense minister. Said, yeah, we're gonna do this a lot. And now France has done this in the Mediterranean. And why are they doing this? Well, they're doing it because Russia responded very weakly. Russia barely murmured a protest, and the Russian Foreign Ministry, to the contrary, issued a statement expressing happiness that the Trump administration had said that it would release all of the sailors who had been arrested. Now, the interesting thing is that those sailors still haven't been released. So, after expressing gratitude to the Trump administration that they intended to release the Russian sailors have not been released. I mean, you could say, yeah, Trump never actually said when are we gonna release them. Just say, yeah, we'll release them, and the Russians seem very happy. Now, this puts Russia in a very difficult situation because obviously this is going to be done on a regular basis. This is a daily thing. So we had the British, we had the Americans, now we have the French, and this is clearly going to be done on a regular basis because there's no deterrent. Why wouldn't they? I mean, this is the French Navy steps in, boom, we're taking this, and this is going to be part of an attempt to squeeze Russia to prevent Russia from earning money on its oil exports. So, just going back to that the story, and it hasn't been covered very much. So yeah, this is not the Macron tweet, and then we have the Washington Post, but this was just a wire story. France's Navy intercepts oil tanker in the Mediterranean sailing from Russia. France's Navy, working with intelligence provided by the UK, intercepted an oil tanker in the Mediterranean that traveled from Russia in a mission targeting the sanctioned Russian Shadow Fleet. French maritime authorities for the Mediterranean said the ship, the Grinch, is suspected of operating with a false flag. The French Navy is escorting the ship to port for more checks. So it's suspected, but they don't have any evidence. They don't know if it's operating on a false flag. They're escorting the ship to a port for more checks. And then there's a Reuters. Local maritime authorities said the Navy seized an oil tanker called Grinch between Spain and Morocco after the team boarded. An examination of documents confirmed the doubts as to the regularity of the flag. So that's their claim. But again, I have to repeat, that doesn't entitle you to seize a ship, because that's just piracy. The ship is currently being escorted by the National Navy to a point of anchorage for further verifications. And then Euronews says French maritime authorities said the ship, the Grinch, is suspected of operating with a false flag. France's Navy intercepted an oil tanker, and then French maritime authorities, blah blah, and then the French ship Navy is escorting the ship to port for more checks. French mission was conducted together with the UK, which gathered and shared intelligence that enabled the ship to be intercepted. And then the ship was flying under a false flag from the Comoros Islands, which are off East Africa, and his crew is Indian. So, how do they know it's a false flag? You see, this is important. How do they? I mean, have they checked it with the Comoros? I mean, the only way you can know that it's a false flag is you have to check it with the Comoros Islands. I mean, this is the flag is of the Comoros Islands, so you have to check, is it registered to the Comoros Islands? All right, if it's not registered to the Comoros Islands, then the Comoros Islands will have a beef with the ship owner. But that's an issue for the Comoros Islands. It's not an issue for France. It's not an issue for the UK. Other than you want to hit Russians' oil tankers or the Russian oil commerce, which is of course what they're doing. But they're using this pretext, and the media mindlessly repeating that somehow you're entitled to seize ships on the high seas if you suspect them of sailing under a false flag. And then Russia shared a fleet, so on and so forth. And then Zelensky, he sent out this tweet who says, "Thank you, France. Thank you, Emmanuel Macron. This is exactly the kind of resolve needed to ensure that Russian oil no longer finances Russia's war. Russia's tankers operating near European shores must be stopped. Sanctions against the entire infrastructure of the Shadow Fleet must be tough. Vessels must be apprehended, and wouldn't it be fair to confiscate and sell the oil carried by these tankers?" All right, so it's very interesting because, of course, today Zelensky was speaking at Davos. He wasn't scheduled to speak. There was a late, a late invitation was extended because somehow he got an invitation to talk to Trump. So he rushed over and he delivered a speech. Now, the striking thing about the speech, I don't know who watched it. It's always very hard to listen to Zelensky. But what he did in that speech today was to berate the Europeans. And one of the issues on which he berated the Europeans. I mean, it was a real irony to the whole thing because, of course, the Europeans have been his greatest champions. It was the Europeans who saved him from Trump's anger and frustration. You remember the disastrous meeting in February in the Oval Office, and the Europeans rallied around and put in a good word for him with um, um, so putting the good word for him with Trump, and then Trump relented, and then of course they did the same with him after the summit in Anchorage. They rushed in. Mustn't let down little Zelensky. Because hey, Trump wants to deal with Putin. Oh, well, what about Zelensky? Zelensky's our friend. Zelensky's our ally. So they remember they rushed to all of them rushed to the White House to sit in front of Trump. And then of course something similar. Of course, after Trump announced the summit in Budapest. So Zelensky repaid the 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 Europeans, as is his wont. He's a very ungrateful person. So he repaid the Europeans by attacking them. Now that they weren't doing enough, he had not. He didn't have any negative things to say about Trump. He had nothing negative to say about Trump. But the Europeans, he berated because they don't do enough. They're just not doing enough. And one of the issues that he raised during his intolerable speech, it was just intolerable. Listening to him is just a really difficult. Um, and one of the issues was that they weren't doing anything about the shadow fleet. They weren't seizing the shadow fleet, and they weren't seizing the oil on this shadow fleet and then selling the oil. And then, of course, sending the revenue along to Zelensky and his friends. I mean, that's the whole idea. You sell it, and then you send it to Zelensky. And now, and as we discussed last week, of course, the idea is preposterous because the the no one's going to trade in stolen goods. I mean, if you let's say you take the oil and then you sell it to somebody else. Well, that's stolen goods, and no one's going to want to receive stolen goods because you are going to be liable to legal action. I mean, it's legal action. I mean, if you knowingly receive stolen goods, if it's unknowing, that's a different issue. But if you knowingly receive stolen goods, then you are absolutely legally liable. So Robert says, let's see what Robert says. Robert says, a ship's flag determines which country's laws govern it. Yep, exactly. By way of taxes, labor rules, safety standards, and liability. Countries change different registration and tonnage fees and compete to attract ships. Yep. Flags of convenience offer low taxes and lax regulation in exchange for steady fee income. Yes. It's essentially jurisdiction shopping at sea, competitive rent seeking, and regulatory arbitrage. Yep. With trade offs in reputation, insurance, and port access. Exactly. There's nothing illegal about it. You can continue to change your registration any number of times you want. There's absolutely nothing at all illegal about it. And you change your registration for all of the reasons that Robert mentions. So the whole idea that there's something illegal about this, there's some criminality here, and that France or Britain or the United States can act as somehow the police officers on the beat. They're the cops on the beat. They can go around arresting people for breaking laws. Nonsense. They haven't broken any law. And then apart from anything else, even according to these stories, they don't have any evidence that any law has been broken. So they just sort of seize it. Well, we're now conducting some investigation. So you arrest someone, and now I'm going to find out whether you've actually broken any laws. They haven't broken any laws, and Macron gives the game away. He says, "Yeah, it's all about we're trying to cut off Russia from its money." Now, as I said, Zelensky said this today in his tirade. Tirade directed at Europe. I want to say it's a tirade. It was a tirade directed at Europe, his great patrons, and so the same Europeans, the same scummy Europeans. Because they're having their meeting right even as we speak. I gather. I think this is the European Council meeting. So the same people who have been moaning and whining and groaning and complaining about Trump and how Trump is so mean to them and how they don't know how to deal with Trump, however, lap it up when Zelensky just craps all over them because he got a standing ovation. I mean, that tirade, which was, as I say, just intolerable, it was greeted with a standing ovation at Davos. And so they they're happy with that, even as they complain bitterly about Trump. And now speaking about Trump, we should talk a little bit about Greenland, because of course it's very, very, very interesting because we obviously were on Tuesday we were talking about that and saying, well, how will this be resolved? And on the surface, it seems as if Trump has backed down from his demand that United States takes ownership of Greenland. Um, after all the howling from the European, is that Trump seemed to back down. So what happened was, there was a lot of anticipation for his speech at Davos. So he delivered that. Started on time. It was surprisingly 2:30 p.m. Local time, and during that speech he said, "Well, I'm not going to use force to take Greenland." And then Trump kind of made a sort of a sarcastic remark after that. Well, now I'm sure you're all sighing with relief. Um, and well, I'm not going to take it, but however, we want it. And that's all we want. We don't get anything from you. You're always ungrateful. We do so much for you. We Americans do so much for you. You never do anything at all for us, and all we're asking for is just a bit of ice. And so, if you give it to us, um, we'll be very appreciative. If you don't give it to us, we won't forget. So it sounded quite menacing, because obviously it was a reminder of that line in the Godfather. If you remember when Tom Hagen goes to Hollywood in order to persuade this big Hollywood studio head to give a job to give a film part to the sort of the Frank Sinatra character, Tony Martin or whatever his name was, so based on Sinatra, to give him that the part that he wanted, and the studio head, just went off on a tirade against the singer, and he said, well, anything else, I'm ready to do any favor for Mr. Corleone at all, whatever favor, just ask me a favor, but not, please don't ask me this. And then Tom Hagen just said, Mr. Corleone never asks for a second favor when he's been refused a first. It's a very, very chilling line because it seems very nice. I mean, okay, he just says, well, he's not going to ask you for a second favor, But obviously, it's quite menacing. And so when Trump said that, we won't forget if you say no to us. But in any case, then a few hours later, he sent out this truth. Um, where are we? That's not it. Let me just find this. Yeah. Okay. So, yep, this should be it. Yeah, so he sent out this truth, in which he seemed to be quite conciliatory, quite conciliatory. So here is says, based upon a very productive meeting that I have had with the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, we have formed the framework of a future deal with respect to Greenland and, in fact, the entire Arctic region. So we have a framework for a future deal. This solution, if consummated, will be a great one for the United States of America and all NATO nations. Based upon this understanding, I will not be imposing the tariffs that were scheduled to go into effect on February the 1st. Additional discussions are being held concerning the Golden Dome as it pertains to Greenland. Further information will be made available as discussions progress. Vice President J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and various others as needed, will be responsible for the negotiations. They will report directly to me. Thank you for your attention to this matter. So then, during one of his kind of impromptu chat with reporters, he was asked, well, it is a part of this framework agreement, is a part of that ownership of Greenland. I mean, you said this is our absolutely irrevocable demand. We take ownership of Greenland, and Trump seemed to hesitate. Didn't he? Just sort of hemmed and hawed and didn't really answer the question. Now, we don't exactly know what's in the framework. Now, the New York Times has given us some idea of what's in the framework, and it's clearly something along the lines that in the U.S. will expand its bases, and that the where the bases themselves will be sovereign American territory. So they won't be, so these won't be bases leased to the United States by Denmark or Greenland. These would actually be sovereign U.S. territory. So it'll be like embassies, but large, obviously, since there'll be military bases, they'll be much bigger. Anyway, so this is just speculation at this stage. So this is the New York Times in today. Saying that after Trump's ultimatum, Greenland talks include sovereign U.S. bases, no drilling for Russia. Negotiators have discussed proposals to check Russian and Chinese influence in the Arctic and transfer sovereignty over pockets of Greenlandic land to the United States, an idea opposed by Denmark. And this is where it gets quite interesting because what Denmark is doing now is insisting that we're not going to give anything up, not even these little pieces of territory that the Americans want. We're not going to give any. We're not going to give anything, any surrender, any 1 square inch of our sovereignty. And this makes it very interesting because if that's the path they want to go down on, that might still lead to a confrontation with. So Akhmatovich says the meeting between Russian President Putin and U.S. President Special Envoy Steve Witkoff has begun at the Kremlin. That's very interesting because it's now, it's quite late. It's close to midnight in Moscow, so that's a big meeting. And apparently, and we'll talk about that in a moment, which Zelensky revealed during his speech at Davos, that within the next 2 days there's going to be a kind of a trilateral meeting between Russia, Ukraine, and the United States, which I certainly don't think that's going to lead anywhere very much, and I think the Russians are going along with this because they want to keep Trump on board. They want to keep Trump happy. So, but that I don't agree with. I don't think that's leads anywhere. But I think that's what I distinguish the Russia-Ukraine from the Board of Peace, which I think is a serious business. And I think that's where I disagree with people who are very dismissive of that. I think the Board of Peace is a real thing. Whether it leads, where it leads, and so on, that's a different issue. But I think that's a real thing. Anyway, let's just go back to the story of Denmark and Greenland and Trump. And it says negotiations to resolve the future of Greenland have focused in recent days on proposals to increase NATO's presence in the Arctic, give America a sovereign claim to pockets of Greenland's territory, and block potentially hostile adversaries from mining the island's minerals. And then it is unclear if these discussions will ultimately yield agreements over the territory. Denmark, which publicly opposes ceding ownership of any Greenlandic land, may not agree to the plans on the table. Still, the officials said they were hopeful that they could simultaneously address Mr. Trump's stated concerns about securing the Arctic against possible threats from Russia and China, while holding to Europe's red line that Greenland was not for sale. And then to do that, the proposals would, one, create a significant new NATO mission in the Arctic. Multiple officials have dubbed this mission Arctic Sentry, in a nod similar to NATO missions in the Baltic and Eastern Europe. And then update a pact signed between Denmark and the United States in 1951. The pact gives the US military wide access to Greenland and autonomous Danish territory for operations, including the construction and operation of military bases. American officials have said they are concerned that this access could be curbed or ended if Greenland were to obtain independence. NATO officials have discussed expanding the 1951 pact with a new agreement that would effectively create pockets of American soil in the territory. And then such an agreement would likely to be modeled on a sovereign base area agreement in Cyprus, where Britain's military bases are regarded as British territory. That would give the United States greater control over the land than it currently exerts over US embassy sites. Mr. Trump and other officials have said the territory in Greenland could prove important for his plans to build a so-called Golden Dome missile defense system. And so on. And then restrict non-NATO member countries, particularly Russia and China, from obtaining rights to mine and the rare earth minerals lying deep under Greenland's ice sheet. And then Mette Frederiksen, who up until now is just known for her rabid Russophobia, but is sticking to the ownership of Greenland. We will fight to the last Dane for Greenland. So Mette Frederiksen did not respond to a request for comment, but in a public statement on Thursday, posted on social media, she appeared to accept some of the details under discussion while rejecting others, including the idea of transferring ownership of any part of Greenland. We can negotiate on everything, political, security, investments, and economy, but we cannot negotiate on our sovereignty. And then here's another story from the Times today. Denmark bristles at the idea of giving up any sovereignty in Greenland. And here says Danish officials pushed back on Thursday against any talk of compromising on the sovereignty of Greenland amid confusion over what kind of deal NATO leaders may have struck with President Trump. And then so she said, we can negotiate on everything. So again, this is Mette Frederiksen. And then she said that she had been speaking with Mr. Rutte on an ongoing basis, but it's not clear how much Denmark has been actually involved in the discussions with Mr. Trump. She seemed to be trying to protect Denmark and Greenland from being excluded and emphasized that Mr. Rutte does not have a mandate to negotiate on behalf of Greenland, nor does he have a mandate to negotiate on behalf of Denmark, she added. Officials in Greenland's semi-autonomous government seemed upset as well about what was unfolding and their lack of participation in the decision-making. I don't know what there is in the agreement or any deal about my country, this is the Prime Minister saying, that over some discussions I didn't attend. I don't know what's concrete in it. So this is a lot of big talk by Denmark. So it's not at all clear as yet whether in fact there is indeed a deal, because if Denmark really does dig in its heels and say we're not going to cede any 1 square inch of the territory of Greenland to the United States, then that's going to put Trump in a bit of a bind, because then he'll be I mean, essentially, you're being made to look a fool. I mean, you say you're going to do this, and then you negotiate with the NATO Secretary General. Apparently, you have a deal, and then Denmark apparently says, we're not going to concede on anything. So you're going to have little Denmark telling the United States, to shove it. So I don't think that's going to work. Um, so I don't think a Greenland crisis has as yet been resolved. Now, going back to um, Davos, I thought what was striking is the growing, I think, belligerence among the Europeans, and there's the clear open talk now about Europe preparing for war with Russia. I mean, it's not they're not even hiding anymore. And here's a Davos. I mean, Davos is really supposed to be a discussion, about economics and business and finance and all that kind of very boring stuff. But instead, there was a lot of talk about uh, getting ready for a war with Russia. And let's keep in mind their idea is not to have a war tomorrow. They're not saying we're going to fight tomorrow. Their idea is to have this war within 3-4 years, the 2030 framework. So let's first of all take a look at Chancellor Schmerz, this German chancellor. Very, very, very nasty piece of work. But here is Schmerz speaking at Davos today. Let's just listen to the tone of Schmerz.
That this is an imperative to counter security threats in the High North. We welcome that the United States is taking the threat posed by Russia in the Arctic seriously. This threat is itself an expression of great power rivalry. It is aimed both at Europe and the United States. We experience it daily in hybrid attacks in the Baltic Sea and in Russia's winter war against the people of Ukraine. We share the conviction that as European NATO allies, we must do more to secure the High North as NATO. This is a common transatlantic interest. Germany is doing just that. We are doing it in the framework of NATO, and we will do more. Our neighbors, partners in Europe, including Denmark and the people of Greenland, can count on our solidarity. We will protect Denmark, Greenland, the North from the threat posed by Russia.
All right, so here we are. This is, without question, this is a call to arms. Germany, we will protect from the threat of Russia. And it's very interesting that the Europeans, and like Schmerz, have now accepted the principle that Greenland is under threat from Russia. Russia is a threat to Greenland. So remember, up until now, it was all supposed to be, oh, this is ridiculous talk from Trump. Trump is just talking rubbish. Trump is lying. So now the new line is, yes, Russia is indeed a threat, and we all, NATO and everyone here, and we need to be on the lookout and on guard for the threat to Greenland from Russia. So the thing about Germany, and I mean, we talked about this before, the Gaggle, is that once Germany goes down this path of this kind of Russophobia and belligerence, and essentially returns to its old habits. They're particularly their intense anti-Russian feelings. Going back to the years before World War II, the years also before World War One. Then I think it becomes very difficult for Russia to sit back because essentially, given the sort of the veneration, the sacralization of World War II in Russia, you can't really have Germany openly suggesting that they intend to rewrite the outcome of World War II, which is what this amounts to. I mean, just basically they're going to rewrite this outcome. They no longer have to pretend. They no longer have to say, "Yeah, well, we're very, very sorry for everything we did to Russia. We're very, very sorry for all of the terrible suffering, terrible misery that we inflicted, and we will never, never, never do this again," which is what they had to say. At least for a while, they didn't. They didn't used to say this in the 1950s, but starting from Willy Brandt, in other words, when Brandt became chancellor in 1969, from that moment on, I think Germans said, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, absolutely. We're never, never going to do this again." But once you have this sort of belligerence coming from a German chancellor, and once he starts saying that Germany intends to be the leading military power in Europe and that Germany is preparing for a war with Russia sometime around 2030, then you have to take it seriously. And then you have to then think about a preemptive strike on Germany. I mean, I think that in all seriousness, I think you have to do that because you can't very well sacralize World War II and then allow Germany, whom you defeated, essentially openly promising that Germany intends to rewrite the outcome of that war. And so I think that's going to pose a very serious problem for Russia really very shortly. Because Merz, I think, has gone further than any of his predecessors. Certainly, I mean, if we're talking about Merkel, never did this sort of nonsense. But certainly, he's gone far beyond anything said by Sergeant Schultz. Schultz at least still tried to restrain himself. Merz, there's no restraint about Merz, and so I think it's a serious issue, and sometime I think within the next couple of years, I think Russia is going to have to address that problem of dealing with Germany, and I would assume how they would do it would be through preemptive strikes. I mean, if they really once it became clear that Germany is preparing for a war against Russia, then essentially you could say, well, we can't go through this again. We can't just sit back and allow Germany to prepare for a war with Russia, particularly as we have said, I don't know how many times, that we're not going to have another Barbarossa on our hands. We can't allow another Barbarossa. So I think that's something that's coming. And then speaking of this European preparation for war, there was another guy who was quite interesting, and this Alexander Stubb, the Finnish president, who's now kind of ubiquitous. I mean, Finland's very small, um, and but Stubb has managed to worm his way in to all of the higher echelons of Western policymakers. So he's in with all the big powers in Europe. Again, amazing for that a small country like Finland is there. But he's also found a rapport with Trump, obviously over golf. Anyway, here was Stubb at Davos. Let's play this.
Be among your European partners? Is there the need for that? And who should lead the charge? Because, I mean, it's a bit unfair. We're sitting here on the panel with Finland and Poland. You know, you are really doing a lot when it comes to defense, especially Finland. You have this comprehensive approach to defense in your country. Are your partners, are they experiencing the urgency? Who needs to come up with the plan B and lead the charge?
Well, I mean, two answers. First is a direct answer to the question of this panel: can Europe defend itself? My answer is unequivocally yes.
Without the Americans?
Without the Americans, I mean,
how?
Well, look.
But you're relying on them for these key elements. How would you do it at scale and at duration and in?
So first of all, take note what he said. Without the Americans. In other words, here we have now we're thinking about Europe. They're going to do this. Now that's itself is sort of very interesting that this is how they're talking, and you know, and as Karaganov explained, and again, you know, you don't have to necessarily take seriously everything Karaganov says. He's a bit of an extremist, but Karaganov was saying that Russia's problem is Europe. It's not really the United States. So back during the Cold War, you know, Russia's problem was the United States, but there was no war between the Soviet Union and the United States. So the Soviet Union and the United States, save for a few crises that were eventually managed quite successfully, like the Berlin crisis, the Cuban Missile crisis, managed to get on and never really came close to war. That's a very different from the situation with Europe, and I think that's why Karaganov told Tucker that this is a real problem for us. You know, so this is a problem for us in the past, and it's again a problem because Europe has gone back to its old ways, and then now obviously threatening us. And so that's when Stubb starts talking about we don't really need the Americans. Well, leave aside whether that's right or not. I mean, it's not, we don't need to argue about that right now. But the fact that they're talking like this and they're preparing like this, then I think it becomes very dangerous. I think because I think America did provide a certain stabilizing force during the Cold War, so the Americans could actually tamp down some of this hysteria. You know, this inherent anti-Russian hysteria among a number of European states, and it's now worse than it ever was in the Cold War because you know some of the most anti-Russian states were during the Cold War under Soviet tutelage. So like Poland and of course the Baltic states were part of the Soviet Union, and then you know then you had Hungary, Romania, where you know obviously under Soviet or communist rule, and so that you know eased some of the pressure on the Russians, and Germany itself, which was always the sort of the problem for the Russians. I mean, you know, even after 1945, the Russians were perpetually worried about the Germans and suspicious of the Germans. You know, they weren't exactly buying into the whole, oh, they've changed. You know, they're good guys now. You know, they're all, you know, they're just into social democracy and saunas and eating their bratwurst. You know, they've forgotten all the bad things that happened. So the Russians weren't exactly buying into that, but they still relied on the United States, and this was the key. The United States kept Germany under control. But now that's fading away. I mean, the United States obviously isn't interested in keeping Germany under any control. So that's why this situation, like you have Germany, and now you have states like Finland. And Finland, you know, that used to be part of the Russian Empire. Finland was certainly an ally of Hitler's in World War II, and it's clear that's you got a problem on your hands. You got Finland, Norway, NATO member states, Sweden. Um, they all worked with Hitler, um, and then you've got the rest. For the time being, at least they don't have Hungary on board. With Orban there who was actually one of the few friends that Russia has in Europe. But who knows how long that's going to last? Orban's got a very tough re-election fight on his hands. And then you've got Romania, which is again on board with NATO. So I think this is a very interesting development here. And when Stubb says, "Well, I don't know that we really need the United States," then that becomes a problem. We can just sort of put something together ourselves, and whether true or not, it's very interesting that he sort of says this. I mean, up until now, this was the official pious declaration was, we need the United States. The United States is the leader of NATO. We do what whatever the Americans tell us. And that's, Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, of course, he was asked, can you envisage NATO without the United States? He says, no, of course not. You can't, no, impossible. But here is Stubb saying something different. Anyway, let's listen a bit more to Stubb.
With an assumption that the United States would cut off completely any kind of work. Yeah. Well, if we look at the defense composure of Europe by and large, in a country like Finland, so how do we do it? We have conscription. 1 million have done it. We can mobilize 280,000 soldiers within weeks. We have 62 F-18s. Your next question is going to be, do they fly without Americans? No, they don't. But do we trust that they will continue to fly because it's in the interest of America to do so? Yes. We just bought 60.
Let's just listen to that again. Let's just go back a little bit and listen to what he just said.
Two F-18s.
Yeah, further back.
Any kind of work. Yeah. Well, if we look at the defense composure of Europe by and large, in a country like Finland, so how do we do it? We have conscription. 1 million have done it. We can mobilize 280,000 soldiers within weeks. We have 62 F-18s. Your next question is going to be, do they fly without Americans? No, they don't. But do we trust that they will continue to fly because it's in the interest of America to do so? Yes. We just bought 64 F-35s. We have the biggest artillery in Europe together with Poland. We have long-range missiles, land, sea, and air. We don't have these because we're worried about Stockholm, right? So, the bottom line is that if you ask me the question that can the Finnish military defend itself against a Russian attack, the whole defense posture of the way in which you do it, yes, we can. But then the second question, which you were alluding to, I think we also have to understand that you fight wars on the battlefield, but you win them at home. And that means that all of us need to focus more on comprehensive security. The civilian side of things. That's why we have civilian shelters for 4.4 million Finns. That's why we have a security of supply where we don't get into any kind of trouble with food shortages, energy shortages, or electricity grids, because we've got this. And this is the, I think, capability that a lot of European states need to do. My absolutely final point. It's all good and well to talk about percentages, but just remember, you don't fight wars with percentages. You fight wars with capabilities, and those you just need to have in stock.
All right, so you can see where he's going on. I want a little bit more with what he says. Let's see.
You said earlier that Europe can defend itself without the Americans. If it comes down,
not exact, Mike. So that's not a quote.
more or less, more or less. We'll go back to the transcript. Yeah. More or less, more or less.
I love journalists.
But if it comes down to it, given the dynamics that we have seen here, does Europe also need to have the potential to defend itself against America?
No, I mean, come on, let's not push the hypotheticals here. Let's get back. Let's get back to the reality of the situation, and let's put it back into perspective, and especially the war in Ukraine, which Gaggle there quite well mentioned. Look, what has Russia achieved in the past 4 years? It's acquired 20% of the territory of Ukraine through military warfare, roughly 2%. In the process of doing that, it has provided about 1 million casualties and dead. It has decreased its sphere of influence. You can see the Central Asian countries, you can see the Southern Caucasus detaching themselves from the Russian Empire. You look at the Russian economy right now. If we go with the inflation rates of the 2 first weeks, we're looking at 30% inflation this year. 16% interest rates, zero growth, no more reserves, incapacity to pay the soldiers when the war ends. So I'm more worried about Russia's unwillingness to end this war because they cannot afford to do so than about Russia's capability to win this war because not end this war because they're moving ahead. So let's keep things into perspective. NATO hasn't entered the scene yet, and they have not been able to advance in the past 4 years as much as expected. This war has been an utter.
All right. So the key here, never mind all the statistics he cites. We don't have to take any of that seriously. It's obviously he's very tendentious. But the key comment here, NATO has not yet entered this conflict. So it's basically saying, look, according to his argument, which is, Russia's really doing very poorly, and NATO has not yet entered the conflict. With this obvious suggestion is that NATO does intend to enter this conflict. In other words, he's basically saying, and I think I've said this here, NATO is biding its time. NATO is waiting for this war to exhaust Russia. The Russia's suffering huge casualties, the economy and so on, and then it plans to enter. And that clearly, Stubb blurted out what the strategy was. Schmerz suggested much the same. We intend to, wait, essentially continue to bleed Russia, and then we will enter at the moment when Russia will be severely weakened, and then we're going to do something that we've been planning on doing for a long, long time. We're going to grab as much Russian territory as we can. Oil, gas fields, lots and lots of very rich territory that they intend to grab, which they obviously grabbed in the 2 world wars. So that's that. That's clearly the NATO plan, and that's why they have no intention whatever of accepting any kind of negotiations. I mean, that's very clear. And Zelensky, in his speech, made clear he was not interested in any kind of negotiations, even though Marty, it didn't look particularly. Didn't look good. I love journalists, but she didn't do anything wrong. That whoever that woman was, she didn't do anything wrong. She was quoting back what he said. She asked him a precise question, can Europe do without can Europe do without the United States? He said, yeah, you can. And then he talked about how, if Finland can mobilize, I mean, again, Finland said we can mobilize 1 million men. Then imagine, what bigger countries can do. I mean, that's clearly, we can mobilize when we need to. We can absolutely mobilize. And yeah, so that's the framework that they're operating under. And so let's just take a look at Zelensky's address. And so this is the where are we? Let me find this. Do we have this? This is it. So yeah, but what was interesting that he decided that he's already got the Europeans in the bag. I mean, it's like, I don't have to worry about them, so I can insult them in terms that Trump would use. In other words, I'm going to sound like Trump in talking about the Europeans. That I can just sort of express my contempt for them, how little that they're doing, and that's going to obviously make them try to do more, which is exactly what happened, because it's not like anyone in the audience said, "You ungrateful, whatever, after all we've done for you." And they said, nah, what have you done for me lately? So here's the Politico story on Zelensky's speech. And so here's the headline: Zelensky scolds Europe in Davos as peace talks drag on. And then Donald Trump and Vladimir Zelensky struck an unlikely note of agreement at Davos. Europe's leaders must do better. A day after the US president bemoaned what he described as a continent ruined by mass migration, the Ukrainian leader spent most of his speech at the World Economic Forum rebuking European leaders for not doing enough to help his country fend off Russian President Vladimir Putin's invasion, nor enough for their own defense. And then Zelensky had a long list of complaints, starting with the European Union's decision not to use frozen Russian assets in Europe to help fund Ukraine. So for all that with the Bart de Wever and everything in the and basically the Europeans wanted to do it. It's only because Bart de Wever, the Belgian Prime Minister, got cold feet, and as we've discussed, the only reason that Bart de Wever got cold feet, not because he thought there was anything wrong in principle with using stolen assets to fund Ukraine. He didn't think there was anything wrong with that. The only thing he was worried about is that Belgium might be on the hook to come up with the money when Russia demands this money back, and that the other Europeans are not going to bail Belgium out. In other words, Belgium will have to carry the bag for the 200, 300 billion euros that will have been gone by then. So that was the only reason that Bart de Wever, who kind of briefly enjoyed the status of some kind of a hero, in Europe because of his obduracy. The CEO was just entirely, hey, I don't want Belgium to carry the bag. And I also, he was worried about the Belgium's reputation in, when it comes to as a reliable banking center. Anyway, so it goes on with this story. And here's Putin managed to stop Europe, unfortunately, he said. What's missing? Time or political will? Too often in Europe, something is more urgent. Europe loves to discuss the future but avoids taking action today. um, it's really contempt. You think, you have such disdain. Imagine having such disdain for Europe. I mean, Europe is the one that keeps you afloat. They're the ones who keep bailing you out. They're the ones who keep financing you. Your lifestyle. They're the ones who keep supporting you when Trump gets angry with you. And now you say Europe loves to discuss the future but avoids taking action today. And then, feisty. It's a feisty. The Britain, this feisty. It's a feisty speech. He also complained about the advice European leaders have given him when it comes to talking with Washington. I don't even need your stinking advice. We are told not to bring up Tomahawk missiles, he said, referring to the long-range weapons that would enable Kiev to strike deep within Russian territory. The same, he said, goes with the German-made long-range Taurus missiles. Now, he's blaming Europe for that. Now, the Tomahawk, it was Trump who has repeatedly said that he doesn't want to give these Tomahawks to Ukraine, even though when was it? Was it in December that Zelensky's been there so often? The last time I think he went to the White House, not just to Mar-a-Lago. When he went to the White House, and then he came. Well, there was a drumbeat of stories. I got to get the Tomahawks. We need the Tomahawks. Give us the Tomahawks. And then Trump kind of said, we need the Tomahawks ourselves. We just don't have enough Tomahawks to spare. And then after the attack, remember the assassination attempt on Putin, and Trump initially was very critical of Ukraine, blaming Ukraine for that assassination attempt, rather than his own side that had obviously provided him with all the satellite guidance. They said, well, thank God we didn't give him the Tomahawks. So now he said, instead of blaming Trump for not getting the Tomahawks, he turns around and blames the Europeans. Hey, you stopped me from asking for the Tomahawks. And then, of course, he brings up this is kind of interesting, because he brings up the Taurus missiles. Now, the Taurus missiles are a very sore point. He goes back to what I was saying, which is, well, they're the Germans. And the Taurus missiles cannot be used without the Germans. The Germans would be needed to use the Taurus. And Sergeant Schultz had ruled out giving the Taurus missiles to Ukraine. Schmerz, kind of during the election campaign, he had said that, well, yeah, he might well give the Taurus missiles. He didn't make a firm commitment, but nonetheless he suggested that he would provide the Taurus, that he might well provide Ukraine with the Taurus missiles. But since then, he's kind of got cold feet. And the reason for that is obvious, which is that in the event of Ukraine using the Taurus missile against Russia, Russia would retaliate against Germany. It's just that the hesitation that Russia has about attacking the United States, even though they know the United States is enabling Ukraine to launch its missile attacks on Russia. They know the Americans are involved in that, and they even, when they've used the Storm Shadow missiles, that they know the British are involved in that. But the Russians have so far been hesitant about taking it out on the British or the French or the Americans. I don't think they would have that hesitation when it came to Germany, because again, they would say the Germans. That's a different story. This is the Germans once again attacking us. This is third time within a little more than 100 years. It's third time. We just can't do it. We can't do it. So I think Schmerz instinctively understands this, which I think is why he's hesitated to give the Taurus, is that Ukraine uses the Taurus, Russia retaliates against Germany. I mean, it would be a proportional response. I mean, it wouldn't be, hey, we're going to take out Berlin, but they probably would take out at least the factories where the Taurus missile is produced, and maybe some weapon systems or missile systems that are in Germany. While you're at it, you might as well do that. So I think that's the danger, I think, for Germany, and I think that also fuels Schmerz's eagerness to build up German strength, because he knows that if that were to happen, if Russia were to hit Germany, Germany would still have to rely upon the United States to retaliate on Germany's behalf, and the United States wouldn't do it. Absolutely wouldn't do it. Particularly, they're using the Taurus. They said, hey, they're Taurus. Hey, you made that decision. You deal with the fallout. So they wouldn't do it, and I think that's why Schmerz, for all his belligerent talk, has not given the Taurus. But you notice how Zelensky brings that up. We got the Taurus. Give us the Taurus. Like, give us the Tomahawk. And then so the Taurus, and he says he also railed against the difficulty the EU often faces in making decisions. Too often, European leaders turn against each other instead of standing together to stop Russia. Europe needs to learn how to defend itself. And then he was careful to name some leaders for thanks, including European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. But overall, there was a note of scorn in his words. And then his tone was sharper this time, especially when he scorned them for dispatching 40 soldiers to Greenland. What is that for? What message does it send? What is the message to Putin or to China? And even more importantly, what message does it send to Denmark? 30 or 40 soldiers will not protect anything. And that's very interesting that he does that here, because, of course, they sent the 40 soldiers to Denmark, or to Greenland, to defend against the United States. So one minute he's praising Trump, and he's full of admiration for Trump, and using kind of Trump's contemptuous words against the Europeans. And then he said, "Wait, well, why don't you do more to stand up to Trump? 40 soldiers? That's not going to do anything. That's not, So whose side are you on? The Americans or the Europeans?" But of course, the only side that he is on is the side for keeping this war going. And of course, the more the Europeans lionize him, and as I said, he delivered that speech, insulting the Europeans, one insult after another, and then he got a standing ovation. So, as opposed to the very cool response that met Trump yesterday. That was, he didn't get a standing ovation. In fact, he barely got an applause. Anyway, then he says here, and then here's again the Washington Post, which says, that was the Washington Post. So one should just say that among the criticisms that Zelensky raised against the Europeans is that they haven't set up the tribunal. You remember they set up this tribunal to investigate the Russian, what other war crimes, to investigate the Russian crime of aggression. Because then the ICC can't really do that because of its statute, and and because Russia doesn't recognize the ICC, and you can't bring charges for the crime of aggression unless you've actually signed on to specifically that you recognize the ICC's jurisdiction to prosecute for the crime of aggression. So I think it was the Kampala Accords. I think that was it. So the ICC can't do it. The ICC has, of course, um, indicted Putin, and even though Russia doesn't recognize the Rome Statute, but because Ukraine does, so ICC can do that. Just as they did that with Netanyahu. So even though Israel doesn't do it, but the Palestinians do, so therefore the ICC did. But that's why the EU said, okay, well, we're going to get around that. We're going to set up our own tribunal to prosecute Russia for the crime of aggression, and then so Zelensky is saying, well, where's that going? And then he kind of said, oh, well, what's the ICC doing? And the ICC doesn't seem to be doing a great deal about Russia, which is kind of a sore point. If you're going to suck up to Trump, then praising the ICC is not really the best way of doing it. I mean, because the U.S. has sanctioned the ICC. I mean, the ICC is under sanction by the United States because of Israel, of course. So that was so it was Zelensky somehow that he's was angry with the Europeans for that. Anyway, let's take a look at our Gaggle locals page. These are the Gagglers who maintain our community, and above all, they maintain the dogs, because they know that the dogs who are the key figures in this. They provide the labor that enables the Gaggle to function. So thank you, Gagglers, who who continue to subsidize or support the Gaggle, and above all to keep the dogs in clover. So thank you, Gagglers. I really appreciate your generosity. Anyway, first question. I think this is the first one. Yeah, the first question. And Stone River, thank you so much, Stone River, for your generosity. I really appreciate it. So Stone River says, George, all the NATO leaders at Davos seem to have bought into the same story. That doesn't surprise me. That the world order has reverted to one of great power rivalries. But are all great powers cut from the same cloth? Russia and China seem to be much less hegemonically inclined than the energetic Trumpian US. It's a very interesting point you raise, and it occurred to me as well, because on the one hand, and it's kind of very interesting, because on the one hand they say, oh, we now got it's great power rivalries. Well, if you talk about great power rivalries, that's the world powers. The world scene now is characterized by great power rivalries. Well, that sounds like almost like a morally neutral position. You say, well, okay, well, that doesn't make the world today any different from the world in the past. What was 19th century about, other than great power rivalries? Well, what was the 20th century about? It's always great power rivalries is par for the course. So if you say that, and that's what they have said, you're absolutely right. That's what they say. Then you're more or less, saying, well, okay, well, if there are great power rivalries, then we just have to maneuver our way or navigate our way through these rivalries. And in a way, if there are great power rivalries, then for smaller powers, it's got a good situation, because then you're able to play the great powers off against one another, which is what happened during the Cold War. A number of smaller powers managed to elevate themselves and become very important players on the world scene, because they kind of maneuvered between the Soviet Union, the United States, like Egypt, for instance. It's a good example that Egypt, which was cultivated first by the United States and then by the Soviet Union. And so Nasser's Egypt, which was a relatively poor country, in fact, not even relatively, absolutely a poor country, nonetheless became a major player on the world scene. The same was applied to India and China, both of whom, at least during the Cold War, were poor countries. I mean, they're not anymore, but at the time they were poor countries, but became very important, as did Indonesia and so on. They all became very important because they could maneuver themselves among the great powers. So if you say that, then you're saying, okay, well, that's the way of the world, and it's not so bad for everyone else. And great power rivalries also have a way of balancing one another out. That's what happens when you're great power rivals. That the great powers usually find a way to maintain a certain balance, and that keeps the peace. That's been the way the great powers competed. Now, so if you were to say that, that's fine. But then what happens with the same Schmerz, because Schmerz had said exactly that. Oh, this is great power rivalries. Is that he suddenly goes into this moral thing about this threat that we're facing, daily threats we are facing from Russia. Well, then if you're doing that, then suddenly you're not talking about great power rivalries. You're talking about you're somehow terrorized by this horrible, evil entity called Russia, which is, of course, what he said. So now you switch the argument, and instead of great power rivalries, you are talking about this need to fight off this evil, monstrous threat that we're under. And so because putting together Europe and the United States in order to fight Russia. So then you go back to the vision of Biden, whom they all, of course, that they're all instinctively supporters of of Biden and the Democrats. All these European leaders, they don't really like Trump. They're trying to make do with Trump, hoping that they'll see the back of him sooner rather than later. I mean, 3 years, okay, but maybe something could happen before then. But anyway, so then he goes back to Biden, and you remember Biden kind of created that League of Democracies. The whole point of this League of Democracies was that this was an alternative power bloc to rival and threaten Russia and China. So that, and that's a much more of a moral issue. Well, these are democracies. Democracy is obviously good. Authoritarianism, and that's obviously bad. And so we are part of the good people, as opposed to that. So it's no longer a matter of great power rivalries. It's about good versus evil. And so Schmerz, who first of all says, great power rivalries, which is, and I think he's using this language because he knows that's the Trumpian language, because that was the language of the national security strategy document. But once he says it, he immediately reverts back to the Biden vision of the good versus evil. That it's a kind of a Manichaean view of the world. So now that's the second. The other thing you're saying is, when you ask, are all great powers cut from the same cloth? Russia and China seem to be much less hegemonically inclined than the energetic Trumpian U.S. I agree with you. I absolutely agree with you. I think what Russia did in Ukraine was in response to a long-standing security threat. I mean, this was this has been building up for a long time, and Russia finally had to act. And one has to say that this Russia, had this been the United States would have acted with much greater alacrity, much earlier. The United States, in Russia's position, would absolutely not have tolerated Ukraine on its borders, Ukraine clearly cultivating enemies of Russia, Ukraine becoming an armed aircraft carrier with its guns pointed at Russia. The United States absolutely would not have tolerated it. It would have long have invaded Ukraine, absolutely outright total invasion, full scale invasion, seized the leaders of Ukraine, and probably either it just would have probably executed them on the spot. I mean, that they might have taken them back to trial, but they would have absolutely got rid of them. That's how the United States would have handled it. Russia went on trying to negotiate, even though they knew that this wasn't the case, and then they finally acted. As I said, I don't think it's about hegemony. I think it's much more about a defensive measure for security, and rightly, because if Ukraine becomes this essentially a NATO bastion, then Belarus will be next. Absolutely, the very next day, they're going to make a move on Belarus, and then essentially Russia will be completely surrounded, completely through all of its western borders, all of them, thousands of miles, would all be bordering NATO. That's a serious step. That is a one crisis. Historical. I mean, you haven't had anything like this in Russian history. So that's why I think Russia acted. I don't think it was hegemony. I think it was if it were hegemony, then Russia would have acted much earlier to exercise its hegemony. I think it was much more about security, and specifically the security threat that emerged during the Biden administration, the first year of the Biden administration, when Biden made clear that he intended to induct Ukraine into NATO. I mean, I think that was they took that very seriously, and that's why they had to act. So it's not about hegemony, and I think the same thing goes for China. I think China sees itself as seeking economic domination. That's its goal. But it's not the same as exercising hegemony over its neighbors, and China has not done that. So I agree with you. I think Russia and China act differently. But as I said before, and obviously that's a much bigger subject, Russia would have been much better served had it acted much more like the United States would have done. I mean, that's the United States acts ruthlessly and brutally and ends any potential security threats without batting an eye. I mean, that's the United States does it. If you start negotiating with the West, trying to work something out with the West, that ain't going to work. And you'd have thought the Russians would have worked that out by now. Anyway, thank you so much, Stone River. Appreciate your generosity. And then Summer Petro says, "Oh, George, recently you mentioned that you thought Keir Starmer isn't really a politician, and is just another clever lawyer." Yeah, okay. In my opinion, he isn't a lawyer either. He can't think on his feet. Witness when he caught in the open following the Stockport murders. Yeah, he was heckled in public, and he could think of nothing to say back, only to dash to his jag. A proper QC can argue black is white and white is black, and watch his opponent get run over at the next zebra crossing. Keir Starmer shows an absence of pathos and rhetorical skills and can't fake sincerity. Well, I mean, everything you say, I agree with. What I did say is not that I thought he was a clever lawyer. I never said he was a clever lawyer. What I said was he's not a politician. He's a prosecutor. A prosecutor is not necessarily a clever lawyer. I mean, I take a clever lawyer as somebody who is a good barrister, somebody who's a good defense attorney, somebody who has great courtroom skills, great debating skills, and all the skills necessary as you say, to persuade a jury that black is white and white is black. I know, so I don't think Keir Starmer has those skills. I think he thinks like a prosecutor. And prosecutors really don't have to use any great skills. I mean, most prosecutions end in convictions largely because most of the people who are prosecuted don't really have any means to defend themselves, and many of them are in any case guilty of the crimes that they're charged with, and so it's quite an easy task. You're a prosecutor, you're going to win 98, 99% of your cases. See, no deal. I mean, most of the defendants don't have any resources. They have to rely on the court appointed lawyers. And the court appointed lawyers, they're so overburdened by so many cases that they have to handle, they can't give any defendant anything more than a kind of pro forma defense. So prosecutors win. They win almost all their cases. And that's who he is. He's a professional prosecutor. He became Britain's top prosecutor. Again, not because of any great legal skills. You don't need any legal skills to be a prosecutor. But this is a way for an ambitious person, because you're going to win almost all your cases. It's a way for an ambitious person to advance through the ranks. Now, what he did at Stockport was particularly disgusting and reptilian in every way, because he went there apparently as a kind of as a show of grief. I mean, 3 little girls had been murdered. I mean, it's shocking. I mean, so he knew that emotions were very raw, and any skilled politician, anyone, somebody like Trump, Obama, Bill Clinton, would have gone there, and there might have been booze, but they would have had some empathy for the people, and they would have been able to address. They would have had the skills, the human skills, to address people's grief without condescension and with some empathy. He didn't have that. When he was greeted with booze, his immediate response was to get defensive and hostile and to be filled with hatred for the people who booed him, rather than think, the reason they're booing is that they're upset, they're very distraught about what happened. And he responded. He went back to London and then launched all these prosecutions against not people who were throwing bricks or or anything, or beer cans or anything else. In which at least you can say, okay, well, they did break the law. They should be prosecuted. No, he launched prosecutions against people for thought crimes. The people who were booing him, the people who didn't like him. That's what the people that he wanted prosecuted. That shows what a horrible person he is. His response, not his response wasn't, "This is horrific." The people's feelings. No. Hey, it's the reaction, the public reaction. That's what's terrible. That's what needs to be prosecuted. So that I just find him absolutely loathsome. But I certainly he obviously has no political skills, but neither did his predecessors. I mean, it's an amazing thing that Britain doesn't seem to be able to produce politicians who have any kind of skills, to really empathize with the public. I can't remember now which prime minister was the last one who had any of those, but I'm sure you remember Gordon Brown. You remember when he was accosted by a woman. I can't remember what was the issue, why she was so angry with him. But then he was caught on a hot mic when he got into the car complaining. Why was this allowed to happen? Why was a woman allowed to accost me and ask me a hard question, a question I didn't know the answer to. I mean, it was caught on a hot mic. Of course, that sealed his fate, which is rather nice. But that's the his. I mean, I guess Tony Blair had some of that, some people skills. Harold Wilson had those skills, but Rishi Sunak. Rishi Sunak, a hedge fund manager, kind of a billionaire hedge fund manager. That's the person you're going to have as your prime minister. Um, and then the horrific Theresa May, the clownish Boris Johnson. It's kind of just extraordinary that you have these wholly unsuitable figures, one after another, as PM. Anyway, thank you so much, Summer Petros. Appreciate. I'll be seeing you, I guess, in Hungary very shortly. And then Robert, thank you so much, Robert, as always, for your generosity. And Robert says, I've actually been meaning to ask George something adjacent to this. To what extent are Russia and China's military structurally and doctrinally defensive rather than hegemonic, especially when contrasted with the West's long history of expeditionary warfare and colonization? Are we projecting our own past onto them? I think it's I think it's much more to do with as you say. I think much more kind of a defensive military. Certainly, Russia in the past, has always been primarily defensive. I mean, its military is trained for defensive warfare. In Soviet times, they did become, much more in the sort of offensive mode. They were trained for an offensive war. And so, yeah, they absolutely were thinking in terms of how would we, if the war in Europe, how would we seize territory, and then how would we hold this territory that was seized? They were absolutely, it was part of their military doctrine during the Cold War. That hasn't been their doctrine, I think, since the demise of the Soviet Union. And I think and you saw that incidentally, that kind of strategy when they invaded Afghanistan. They showed great skill. They knew exactly how to do it. How you overthrow the government, you seize the capital, you seize Kabul, then you bring in your forces and so on. So they'd mastered the techniques of offensive warfare. I don't think they have that. I really don't think they really had any idea of how to wage a proper offensive war against Ukraine in 2022. I think it's surprising, but they didn't do that. And that's why, I said it at the time. The United States would have done this very differently. At the very least, they would have taken out Ukraine's military capabilities, all of their military capabilities, before launching the invasion. You hit all their anti-aircraft systems, you hit their airfields, hit their communications. You do everything. It's just exactly what George W. Bush did prior to the invasion Iraq, and his dad also. I mean, in other words, you ensure that there's pretty much almost no defense that's left. Then you move in your infantry. You don't move your infantry in when they still have all of their military capabilities extant. So that showed the limitations of how to fight offensive war. And I think that's true. Also about Taiwan. I think, and I really don't think that's what China has in mind. I think China has ever thought in terms of seizing Taiwan, waging any kind of an invasion. I think that's just not in their in their military planning, which is, I think, very different than the United States. The United States would absolutely be thinking in terms of how do we seize this island. What would we do? What would be step one, step two, step three? I think so. I absolutely think that both Russia and China are much better at uh, and their military strategy is based on thinking defensively, and they're just not that good at at planning for offensive wars. So anyway, thank you so much, Robert, and then Cynthia. It was good to see you, Cynthia. As I always say, Cynthia's a film scholar, encyclopedist, with amazing knowledge of cinema at her disposal. Great deal of uh, learning about the making of films and the production, the direction, films, everything that's involved in the mechanics of filmmaking, and she. Uh, enlightens Gagglers every week with her amazing knowledge of cinema, and really appreciative. And on Monday we had part two of Ivan the Terrible. Strongly urge everyone to watch it. It's a classic. As always, it's with classics. It's not the easiest of films to watch, but then great classic literature is not the easiest to read, but you kind of have to do it, and but what makes it all worthwhile is to even if you have difficulties with the film, is Cynthia's running commentary, which helps you to understand and appreciate everything that's going on. So watch the film and read Cynthia's comments, and then next week we're having a screening. The poll is, I think, what was it? Vamps, femme fatales, and uh, uh, moral nullity. I think that's the theme, and I think that's an interesting one because we've got 8 films selected, and at the moment we have All About Eve, which is a classic. It's a woman's film, but a very good film. But All About Eve is leading the poll, but close behind is Belle de Jour, which is a very funny film. It's a classic by Buñuel. We've had Buñuel before, but this is one of his masterpieces, Belle de Jour, with a young Catherine Deneuve. And then running in number 3 is one of the greatest film noirs ever, which is Double Indemnity. So if you haven't voted, please go to the to our Gaggle locals board. Please vote and see. We'll see who comes out on top. As I say, at the moment, All About Eve is in the lead, but that could change with if people throw in their vote. So please vote. Anyway, now back to Cynthia's question. So Cynthia says Greenland isn't a source of profit for Denmark. It's funded as a public expense. Yes, each year Denmark spends roughly 1 billion to provide Greenlanders with free healthcare and education. Yeah. Patients face no medical bills, and serious cases are flown to Danish hospitals at Denmark's cost. The same funding supports schools, universities, and student stipends, including for those studying in Denmark, ensuring cost-free access to services across the island and abroad. And then Cynthia goes on. So if the US takes over Greenland, it would inherit its lavish welfare system. America would rightly resent paying for free healthcare and education for Greenlanders while getting none themselves. Cut the benefits, and Greenlanders revolt. Keep the benefits, and Americans flood in to claim the freebies. Either way, the US would struggle to justify the cost and why it brought the territory. Why it bought the territory in the first place. No, I think those are all those are very good points. You're absolutely right. If the United States were to buy out uh, Greenland, um, that I mean, they would always have to. The United States would have to pay Denmark a certain sum of money, Denmark would almost certainly put in a ridiculously overinflated estimate of what it's owed. And as you say, it's actually a net loss to Denmark. And since Denmark is not a serious military power, so you can't say, well, you're taking away our security. What security? So the United States would have to pay Denmark. And then, of course, the United States would have to pay to Greenlanders. So I think every Greenlander would be provided with with a nice chunk of money, and to see them through to their old age. Now, I'm not sure the healthcare would necessarily be a deal breaker, because I would assume that they would probably work out some kind of an arrangement whereby Greenlanders would continue to enjoy all of their health care and welfare benefits that they enjoy now, but they will get them from Denmark. In other words, America would own Greenland, but the Greenlanders would still enjoy their Danish citizenship. I mean, and it certainly doesn't sound as if the Danes, the Greenlanders want to take an American citizenship. So if they retain their citizenship, so they'll have the right. You can stay here, go on living. You can go on having your Danish citizenship or Greenland citizenship, whatever you want. You don't have to take out an American citizenship. You can go on living here, and therefore, if you are going to retain your Danish citizenship, then you'll still collect your welfare payments from Denmark. So the Americans probably will be off the hook as far as healthcare is concerned. I don't think you're going to provide them with any welfare. It's just not. That's not the American way. They're not going to do it for these Greenlanders. But they're going to have to cough up some money. I mean, I think that for the Greenlanders to be at least reasonably content, I think you'd have to pay some money to the Danish government. A lot of money. The Danes are going to ask for a lot of money, and then the Greenlanders would have to get. I don't know what sum would be reasonable, but I would imagine. You have something like probably at least $50,000 for all inhabitants. So that's quite a lot of money. That's quite a lot of money. But that wouldn't be that unpopular if the United States were to acquire Greenland, and so Greenland would still become a part of the United States. Now, the people who would move into Greenland, any Americans who decide, hey, I'm going to make my home here, I'll have a nice ski resort here or whatever. They would still be American citizens, and they would be enjoying American style health and welfare. I don't think they would get, if you're an American citizen, I don't think you'll be entitled to enjoy Danish, health and welfare systems. So I think, the Americans just buy off, the Greenlanders and Denmark. But at the moment, it's not looking like it's going to happen. I mean, which is, to be honest, a little baffling to me, that I don't get why Denmark is so insistent upon this. I mean, particularly as they could get some money for this. I think the Americans are actually, Trump would be willing to pay quite a lot of money to Denmark for Greenland. I mean, the kind of money that would set up Denmark for a long time. I mean, so if somebody, you buy someone out, that could be a nice chunk of change. I mean, what does Denmark need Greenland for? I mean, what's the point of it? It doesn't add anything to Danish security. It doesn't add anything to Denmark's prestige. I mean, nobody even cares about Greenland. Um, and I don't know why the Danes are being so insistent, given that Trump is offering them a lot of money. And why are they saying no, no? And now, even as we were looking earlier, about this new offer that's being negotiated with Mark Rutte, whereby the United States would own the actual military bases that would be located in Greenland. They would own the whole thing. It was sovereign American territory, and Denmark isn't even willing to accede on that point. That makes, to me, that just makes absolutely no sense. And you think, if I were Trump, I'd say I'm sick of this. I mean, what the hell? I mean, we provide them with all this security, and obviously that's what NATO has been. NATO has been a racket by the Europeans, so they don't have to pay anything for their military, and then the Americans would provide them with security free of charge. It's a racket. And then Trump said, "Well, hey, what can you give us something in return?" And the Danes said, "No, we're not going to give you anything in return, but we still want our freebie." So, yeah, so that's it seems like the Danes are just refusing to negotiate. You look at this Mette Frederiksen. She just doesn't. I mean, she's not really willing to compromise on anything. So we'll see how that works itself out. But I don't think there would be any question of providing any Danish style health and welfare systems on the American taxpayer's dime. I think it's not going to happen. I think they're going to give it to them till the Greenlanders, hey, you want to be a part of Denmark, you can retain your citizenship, you can go on living here. What would be American territory. But if you're going to retain your Danish citizenship, then don't ask us to provide you with any free healthcare or anything like that. Anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. And then Cynthia says, empires don't usually collapse in one big moment. They fade when the story they tell about their strength stops making sense. Taking Greenland by force wouldn't look powerful. It would look desperate. When a country starts seizing territory instead of building partnership, it isn't leading. It's signaling insecurity and weakness. Allies could see recklessness. Rivals would see it as an opening, and markets would see risk. And when gold rises, it's the oldest signal there is trust is slipping. Well, I think that's already been happening. Gold has been rising for a long time, so there's no trust. I think that's right. I mean, all of that is true, except that when you pull something like that off and you succeed, then you've induced a certain feeling of awe and respect on the part of others. They see, hey, you did it. A lot of people thought you wouldn't do it. You did it. You pulled it off. And now everybody else has to accommodate himself to the new reality. So you're right. You use force instead of persuasion. In a way, it's a sign of weakness. But if you succeed, then it's very quickly seen as a sign of strength. But that's the proviso if you succeed. So, like with Maduro, you can say, well, that's a failure on the United States. They couldn't work something out with Maduro. True enough, but they undertook what struck me as being a difficult operation. I mean, I know somebody said, well, they just did it. They bought somebody off or whatever. We don't know exactly how this was pulled off. Whether Did they really have these devastating weapon systems that Trump is suggesting, or was it that they just simply bought off, um, you know, key figures within the Venezuelan military structure? We don't yet know. We will find out. But either way, nothing succeeds like success. I mean, you did it. How you did it is a different issue, but you did it. If they'd undertaken that and they had failed, then you look weak, and that is. So I think that's ultimately what counts against you when you do something and then you fail. Then you kind of look pathetic. So when Jimmy Carter tried to rescue the hostages in 1980 and he failed, and Americans lost their lives, he looked weak and ineffectual. But if he'd pulled that off, if he'd succeeded, then he would have looked very strong. So same way, Trump took a risk. Um, I don't approve of it. I obviously don't approve of it. I've said a lot about it. I think it's obvious a violation of international law, violation of all law. Um, but having done it, he had succeeded. Um, and if he hadn't, if it failed, we would. If that operation failed, and Americans had got killed, and Maduro would still be in Caracas, it would have been devastating for Trump. Trump would have looked pathetic and ridiculous, and would all be mocking him and so on. So he took a risk, and he pulled that off. I mean, we can then argue in long term and so on, but ultimately, if you undertake an operation and you succeed, then you will succeed in inspiring awe and respect in others. Hey, he did something risky, could have gone disastrously wrong, but it worked. Yeah. So anyway, thank you. And then Cynthia says, Bloomberg admits Russia has scored a windfall from soaring gold prices since the war began. Kirill Dmitriev tweets Russian reserves are up at least 216 billion. Brussels froze 140 billion at Euroclear. But by wrecking trust in Western finance, they sent gold skyrocketing, giving Russia gains that now exceed what was seized. Russia profits, Western credibility burns. A win for Moscow, a masterclass in self-harm from Brussels, as Ursula would say, tatters, tatters, I tell you. So that's an interesting point. So what you lose on your frozen assets, you gain with gold, and that's reasonable argument. I wouldn't quite put it like that, because I still think that your objective has to be, in a war like this, it has to be to win the war. I mean, it's that's the most important thing. Whether you lose some money here, gain some money, you could always think all sorts of ways in which the Russian economy has suffered as a result of the war. But but leave that aside. Ultimately, what does matter is to win the war. You have to win it, because if you don't, then you're putting yourself into more and more of a dangerous position. So, whereas that's fine. I mean, that's an interesting issue, that you have these gold reserves, and that's you've gained through the rise in the price of gold, more than you've lost through the reserves. However, however, you shouldn't have left those reserves. That's still Russian taxpayer money. I mean, it's still just to write it off. That's not good enough. That's it's not. That money belongs to the Russian people. I mean, that's Russian taxpayer money. You can't just simply have Europeans or anyone else seizing it. That belongs to the Russian people, and so losing that is I think that's not a good look for Russia, and I think they're never going to get that money back. But it's good that they've gained through through gold prices. Anyway, thank you very much, Cynthia. It's really, really interesting. Um, and and then and then Steve points out the U.S. has 8,000 tons of gold, if you believe it, which has also gone up in value. Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I also thought that. Well, that affects everybody else who owns gold, but but in terms of Dmitriev's argument, which is, well, let's just focus on Russia and how much Russia has gained and how much Russia has lost. Okay, so Russia has gained through the rise in the price of gold, but it shouldn't have left that money in those um, in those banks. I mean, it's you don't. If there's one thing when one knew, with 100% certainty before launching the the so-called at the time, they called it the special military operation at the time. They still call it that, which is bizarre. But 4 years later, it's still a special military operation. But nonetheless, the one thing you knew with 100% certainty is that the Europeans were going to seize this money. They would freeze it, and you would never get it back. Iran still hasn't got any of that money back from 1979. I mean, so that's it. You're going to lose whatever 300 billion euros. That's a lot of money. As I say, it's taxpayer money. I mean, that belongs to the Russian people. You can't just simply say goodbye to 300 billion and then just shrug your shoulders. So so anyway. And as Steve says, French seizure, you predicted that didn't take long. Yeah, no, I think that's right. That was obvious, and there's going to be more. It's going, I'm fully expect, by the weekend, and there's going to be more seizures because Russia has so far responded very weakly. Well, if you respond weakly, you encourage others to beat you. I mean, it's I think it was a Danaki. No, I think that was somebody who was always quoting Putin's comments. The weak get beaten. Yeah, I mean that's what happens. If you don't respond when somebody hits you, you're going to get hit again. I mean, everybody knows that from experience. Whoever got bullied at school, if you don't hit back against the bullies, you're going to continue to get bullied. I mean, that's human nature. So anyway, French, when a big bully is picking on a kid, the little bullies love to join in. Always, always. That's exactly. I mean, it's the human animal nature, which is the moment people sniff out weakness, they're unable to resist exploiting that weakness. So it was entirely predictable, and it's going to go on. And I mean, unless Russia decides to use its naval power to stop this, then there's going to be more and more of this. It's going to be a regular thing, and in order to prevent any more of this oil trade. I mean, that's the whole purpose is to prevent Russia from selling its oil. I mean, it's obvious that they would do this. They didn't take the risk early on. As always, they were probing and see how Russia would respond, and they've seen Russia responded weakly, and so they're going to continue. But the objective is to prevent Russia from selling oil. So that's why Zelensky was so gleeful. And then Steve says Russia's choice: complain at the UN or a torpedo. Well, complaining at the UN is a complete waste of time. Because it's just all of the Western powers are just going to go through their routine, denouncing Russia, and then all their ridiculous claims about, it's entirely in accord with international law and blah 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 blah. And then you're just going to get into, the Russians are going to say no, it isn't, and then the West is going to say yes, it is, and so it'll be completely pointless. So it's up to Russia really to use force. A torpedo, absolutely. Torpedo, you can use a torpedo. You can use your air power. It's not hard. ships are very easy to hit. I mean, can't think of anything. We don't have naval wars anymore. I mean, because ships are just so vulnerable. You can hit them with a submarine. You can hit them from the air. I mean, they're easy to hit. I mean, the whole idea that a naval vessel just sort of goes around doing whatever it feels like without any kind of punishment. I mean, that's ridiculous. So we'll see how Russia responds. But this so far it's been so weak that things will get a lot worse very shortly. And then here is Marty. Or Marty's always got some good. So what's it? Keefe, New Statesman. Wow, this is New Statesman has this picture of Starmer as Superman. Wow. That's not somehow that is not the way I would think of Starmer. So Europe is back. This is the new mindless cliche. Europe is back. Starmer's next move, so on. So that's Europe is, there's a lot of this empty talk from the Economist, Financial Times. Europe is back because they somehow are defying Trump. We're all defying Trump. Keefe, that's a Keefe. Yeah, Keefe. Yeah, that's the way. That's the you got to get the appropriate Cockney accent. Keefe. You don't say Keith, and you don't say Keefe. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Marty. I really appreciate that. And then here's another picture from Marty. Let's see. Let me see. So that's wow. That's as gruesome a sight as I mean, Marty outdoes himself. When he posts these pictures. So this is I don't know when this picture was taken, and so that it seems like some kind of a golf. Everyone is holding a trophy. So the person on the left, I'm not quite sure. He looks vaguely familiar, but it looks like somebody was aged a little bit. So I can't quite figure out who's the person on the left. Oh, I think it may be a golfer, one of the great golfers, but I'm not sure which golfer. I mean, maybe Gary Player. Yeah, maybe it's Gary Player on the left. Then Trump also holding a cup, and then Stubb is holding a club, and then we have not a club. Stubb is holding a cup, and then we have Lindsey Graham was also holding a cup. Lindsey Graham wearing a ridiculous shorts. I mean, just an embarrassment to look like that with those shorts and with those two strings hanging out of his shorts. Oh, sorry, they're his legs. I just thought they were like two strings hanging out of his shorts. Those are actually called his legs. And then next to Lindsay is that guy from South Carolina. What was his name? God. There used to be a congressman from South Carolina, Trey Gowdy. That's the one, Trey Gowdy. So this picture must have been taken a little while ago since I've forgotten about Trey Gowdy. And Trey Gowdy, I mean, he's in a kind of strange pose because he doesn't have a cup in his hands. Everyone else has a cup, but he seems like almost like he's got his arm around him. He seems very close, standing very close to Lindsay. That is a gruesome sight. That is not a nice that's not a nice picture. Yeah, I don't know when was this taken, but it not nice. And anyway, and if Marty has this, that's the picture of Stubb, and someone says, "Please stop with the Stubb speak." I can't stop it. I can't. I can't help myself. I just it's that name. Just I have to play around with it. But the one thing I'd have to say, and maybe I haven't heard Stubb enough. I'm not sure exactly I mean, that can easily be looked up where he got his education from, but he speaks perfect English, absolutely perfect English. I mean, you wouldn't get any Englishman speaking English as well as that. He's got a perfect accent, so and he speaks absolutely perfectly. Sentence constructions and quite elaborate sentence construction. It's very impressive that he's mastered English as well as he gets, and it's a very polished performance. And given how polished his performance is, then I can see why Stubb is so beloved by Trump and by the Europeans. Trump has often spoken in the past that he loves the sound of English, English, English. So that's why he said, when he's listening uh, to Starmer, oh, this is loves listening to Englishmen speak. He doesn't realize how badly Starmer speaks, but to Americans, the moment they hear the English accent, they get a little gooey. So he says that, but he Trump even gets a little gooey when he hears Schmerz speaking English with this German accent. I think he likes the sound of that as well. But I can see why once he listens to Stubb, he thinks, "Wow, this is great. Look how beautiful he speaks. It's so articulate. I mean, these elaborate sentences that he constructs even as he speaks. That's really impressive." So I think that helps along with the golf, and he does have a certain athletic build. I mean, maybe because he played golf at quite a high level, that he kind of looks quite athletic. But these are all things that obviously appeal to Trump, and that's the secret of Stubb's rise to such lofty heights. I mean, imagine a Finnish president, is up there with the leaders of Europe and the United States. Um, and anyway, then we have Aristotle once says, "What do you think about the idea that Trump's peace council is an actualization of the long-standing Israeli desire to replace the United Nations with a new structure, with Trump in charge? This, of course, fully owned by Israel." Um, well, I mean, it's a little late now. I was planning to talk a little bit about the peace board. I actually don't think Israel will be able to pull this off, and I don't think the idea that this is the substitute for the United Nations is really feasible. There just aren't enough members on the peace board, and in any case, you only have a slot on the peace board if Trump invites you, and if you pay up $1 billion, then then your seat is permanent. Well, I don't know how many states are actually going to pay up $1 billion for a permanent seat. I mean, Hungary is now on the peace board, but that's just an invitation. But I doubt whether Hungary is going to cough up $1 billion. I mean, Hungary doesn't have $1 billion. It's not going to go down very well among Hungarians if they cough up $1 billion. So that's going to be a problem with a number of states, whether they're really going to cough up $1 billion, and therefore their position on the board will only be for 3 years. So that's I think one thing. I just don't think that it's feasible that you could replace the UN with this body. That what Biden tried to do is much more um, likely was seen, I think, as much more likely to be a replacement of the UN when Biden created the League of Democracies. In other words, he could then create a new international community that were countries that were more or less aligned with the United States, or at least were not aligned against the United States, and that by excluding Russia and China, he could create a body that would no longer exercise a veto over U.S. plans, and that's long been the U.S. Bugaboo about the United Nations, which is that, well, Russia and China are two permanent members of the Security Council, and they exercise their veto. So America is unable to get its way, whether it's on Iraq or whether it's on Yugoslavia. Basically, America just couldn't get its way because of Russian and Chinese veto. So, as you see, in the case of the peace board, Trump has invited Russia to take part. So that the rationale of creating a new United Nations falls apart if you include Russia, because Russia is obviously going to be, not an adversary necessarily of the United States, but nonetheless, Russia would have its own agenda, would have its own ideas, and would exercise its veto. So if you are trying to create an alternative to the United Nations, you don't invite Russia, you don't invite China, you do what Biden did, which is you create a league of whatever as an alternative international community, ignore Russia and China, ignore all the states that you don't like and who might have a different view of the world from the United States. Just don't include them. And then you can get to do what you want because you don't have to worry about the veto anymore, which is what the U.S. really objects to about the UN, which is the veto. So I don't see it in this case. Trump has brought on Russia, bring in Russia, and therefore you don't get any advantages as an alternative to the UN. And I can see when Trump visits China in April, that's going to be a state visit to China, and I can see him going to Xi and say, "Hey, why don't you join the peace board? You've got $1 billion to spare." And I don't know how China will respond, and I don't even know how Russia will respond. Russia's still considering the invitation, but if you do bring in Russia and China, then you're not creating an alternative to the United Nations, or at least an alternative that would work better for the United States. So I disagree with that whole argument, which I've been hearing all day from these tiresome European moaners and whiners. Oh, there's going to be a United Nations, which they couldn't care less about the United Nations. They're just always complaining about something. So I don't agree with that. I think in principle, this could act as a restraining force on Israel. I'm not saying it's going to lead to Palestinian self-determination and any of that, because you can't expect the United States turn around from one day to the next and say, well, we now embrace the cause of Palestinian self-determination. Well, that's not going to happen. Just the United States isn't going to do that. But if you can start limiting Israeli rule, Israeli influence in Gaza, in the West Bank, then you're achieving something. And remember, who's on the peace board? The peace board. You got Egypt is there, Qatar is there, Saudi Arabia is there, United Arab Emirates is there, Turkey is there. These are all states that are absolutely not tolerant of Israel. They're not going to be there in order to sign off on anything that Israel does. So it's not going to be something that's going to enable Israel. If you bring all these states on, then that's going to be a problem for Israel. And the second thing is that, or I don't know if it's the second or whatever. Trump has now set up. This is phase 2. So a lot of people said, "Oh, that's not going to happen." But we now have a peace board. There's also the executive committee that's answerable to the peace board. But even more important, there is this Palestinian, whatever it was called, Committee on National Government, or the one, the technocratic government that has been set up. It has the guy who's the head of this technocratic committee has said today that as of next week, the Rafah crossing will be opened in both directions. People will come in or people will go out. I'm not saying that's going to happen. That may well not happen. We know what the Israelis are like. So it may not happen. But nonetheless, he, you know, issued this message today by video. He wasn't physically present at Davos, but nonetheless he delivered a message at Davos and said the Rafah crossing will be open next week. So they've moved towards the creation of at least a not exactly a government as yet, but nonetheless this technocratic committee that supposedly will run Gaza. So we're a long way from anything. But why, I take this seriously is that it is happening, and when the more it happens, and the more Trump gets involved in this, I mean, Trump really now becomes um, committed to this, and the more other countries get involved, it's going to be harder and harder for Israel to simply ignore everything, relaunch its war, um, and just simply defy the United States, defy everybody who is involved in this, defy others who have coughed up $1 billion. Say, hey, we're going to lose $1 billion. So that's why I take this seriously. That doesn't mean it's going to work. It doesn't mean that it's we're in a new, you know, new era in the Middle East and so on. I do think it should be taken seriously. I disagree with those who dismiss it out of hand. Um, so that, but we'll talk about it at greater length next time. Aristotle, thank you very much for your generosity, says, "Hail Trump the Terrible." Okay. Keep in mind, I mean, if it's a play on Ivan the Terrible, remember, it's translated as terrible into English, but in Russian it's Ivan Grozny. Grozny isn't quite terrible. Grozny means is someone who inspires fear. He inspires terror in others. So it's not exactly terrible as like what he's a terrible person, but he inspires terror. So that's not wholly uncomplimentary. And then David Rogers says, "Thank you for all your broadcasts last year, and hope you continue in 2026." Well, I hope. Well, thank you so much. It was very generous words, and I hope to continue. I mean, unless something happens to me, then I intend to continue through 2026. So thank you, but thank you. It's very generous of you. And where are we? Yeah. So here's. Oh yeah. Marty provides it. So thank you very much, David. I really appreciate your generosity and your kind words. And here's Marty with an explanation for that horrific picture. So it's from 29th of March, 2025. So it's from about a year ago. And so it's from Lindsey Graham, a tweet. He says, "I was honored." I can't do an imitation. I'm not even going to try. "I was honored to play in and win the Trump International Spring Member Guest Tournament today." Spring Member Guest Tournament today. So but why are they all holding cups? I mean, if you have a tournament, then only one person can win. No, okay. I was honored to play in this week. Okay, President Trump was awesome. Oh, God. Finnish President Alexander Stubb, who played golf at Furman University, was amazing. See, he's trying to sound like Trump. Trump was awesome. Stubb was amazing. The legendary Gary Player, so it was Gary Player, okay, was the Rock of Gibraltar. Trey Gowdy occasionally helped. I almost never helped, but we won. MAGA. Well, that's pretty gruesome. I always assumed Lindsey Graham wasn't much good at golf. I always thought he just goes to these things just to suck up to Trump. But I don't know. I mean, once you create this kind of a competition like International Spring Member Guest Tournament, I mean, you can narrow it down. That basically there's no one else other than you taking part in the competition. So once you just kind of eliminate all possible competitors, other than yourself, then you're guaranteed to win. So anyway, thank you so much, Marty. Anyway, I think my time is up, and so thank you so much, everybody who joined me. Thank you so much for all of your generosity. Thank you for all of the interesting and lively comments and questions and observations. Really appreciate that. Thank you, everyone who contributed to the tip jar. The dogs, they're not in a good mood these days. It's this cold winter, and the tip jar just adds to their aggravation. They need to take some kind of blood pressure medication, I think, because it's just the stress is not good for them. But so they'll be waking up soon, complaining, blaming me for everything under the sun. So really appreciate those of generosity. Appreciate your kind words. It's a long shot. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Um, we will be back. We'll do some podcasts over the weekend, and then I hope we'll be able to do a live stream with Peter next Monday. See if his VPN problems have been solved. But I will be back next Tuesday, same time, 3 p.m. Eastern time. Until then, all the best. Good night. See you then. And don't forget, Monday we're doing the screening for the what is it, Vamps, Moral Nullity, and Femme Fatales, or whatever. Please vote for which film you want to watch. So see you next week. All the best. Bye bye.